There are lots of things we can do with data, lots of ways we can work with data. It's good to have some guidelines, and it's good to know why we might employ those guidelines. So fair and care, there are two sets of principles. They can give us some kind of framework for how we manage data, how we work with data. And one of the ideas I'm going to try to give you in this presentation is that these two sets of principles relate to two different communities with which we might interact. That there are principles which guide us in relation to one community and principles which guide us in relation to other communities. Kit, who you've all seen in action earlier today, is a powerhouse, and she's given good instructions on what I'm supposed to achieve in this session, and one of those instructions is make 3 points. So I'm going to try and do that, and they'll come up in bold when we get to them. I think it's a widely accepted proposition that if we share data and let people reuse data, this is a way of advancing knowledge. Data should not be a use it once and chuck it away kind of stuff. It's stuff that it's worth preserving. Well, I don't know for you, but for me, you know, I spend time, or I have spent time collecting data. I have spent time curating data. The data is valuable. I wouldn't have done that, put that time in if I didn't think the data was valuable. And I don't want to think that the value stops at me. I think that other people can gain value from that data as well. So if we accept it, then we have to think about what we can do to make it work smoothly. And there are just some basic things we can do which will enable other people to use data that we have created, or make it easier to share data with other people if we're managing it. And that's where the FAIR principles come in. These are big aspects of how we manage data so that it can be used by other people easily. Oh, stop it. Oh no, sorry. I hit the wrong button. Okay, so the FAIR principles. F is for findable. Metadata and data should be easy to find for both humans and computers. Okay, so this is basic. How can exists? This is what findability means. It means telling people that something exists so that they know whether they might be interested in it or not. The principle here, probably where we start. It's probably more important because that's where people are going to discover your data. They're going to see a description of it and say, oh, I'm interested. The bit about humans and computers is maybe not so relevant for us in the humanities and sciences and Indigenous area. There are facilities where metadata feeds are updated on a daily basis so that you know what the latest things that have become available are. But in a lot of cases, what we're interested in needs us to actually look at something and say, oh yeah, that looks interesting. We're working with search engines, data portals, discovering items. So that's findable. People can find out that the data exists. Accessible. Once the user finds the required data, they need to know how the data can be accessed, possibly including authentication and authorization. So think about this. You're working through Google or some portal, you've searched on some particular terms, an item comes up, a data set, and you're going, oh yeah, this is what I've been waiting for. This is the data set of my dreams. You click on the link and you get a message that says, not accessible, authorization required. This is information you want to have as early as possible in the process. You want to know, can I actually access this data directly? If not, what do I need to do? Will I be able to get to the data if I go through a certain process? This part of FAIR, the A, is sometimes misunderstood and sometimes acts as a deterrent to people like us who are working with data from people. Data which in many cases cannot be freely shared. There need to be access conditions. Some people, or if you're being lazy maybe, you might read this A as being accessible means open access, means everything's going to be shared to everybody. But you read and it's not saying that, it's saying no, we recognise that some data cannot be freely shared, but you need to tell people about that. You need to give them all the information that's relevant so that they can decide whether it's worth pursuing, whether they're going to get it, or whether they're just going to forget about it. I is for interoperable. The data usually needs to be integrated with other data. In addition, the data need to interoperate with applications or workflows for analysis, storage, and processing. So again, this is about providing people with enough information. Is the data in a format that I can feed into a tool I want to use? Is the data in a format that I'm going to be it's going to be easily possible for me to combine it with another data set that I already have? Or is it going to take 2 weeks of a data scientist's time to achieve those ends? Data scientists, if you talk to them, that's what they spend most of their time doing actually, massaging data, wrangling data so that it can be fed into particular tools or so it can be combined with other data. So it's important that people know about this, about the state of data. Is this data in some completely personal, idiosyncratic format that you've dreamed up and nobody else has ever used? It happens, right? And you need to know about that if possible. And then R is for, oh, sorry, I'm hitting the wrong buttons all the time, for reusable. The ultimate goal of FAIR is to optimise the reuse of data. To achieve this, metadata and data should be well described so that they can be replicated and or combined in different settings. So, as I hope I've given you the sense already, the first 3 principles feed into this. Aiming for data to be reusable, to make it reusable as easily as possible. We want it to be easy to find. We want it to be as easy to access as is possible, as is reasonable. We want to know whether we can use it with tools and other data we already have. All of this, we want this information as early as possible in the discovery process. So the crucial bit here, I think, is metadata and data should be well described. We want as much information to be given to us as early as possible so that we know what's of real interest to us, we know what we can work with. Okay, so, as I said, I want to try and give you the idea that these principles relate to how we interact with different communities. And I would say that the FAIR principles are there to show us how we interact with the scientific community, the scholarly community. We're humanities and social sciences people, so I'm unashamedly going to introduce the name of Max Weber, famous German sociologist, who wrote extensively on the idea that science is a vocation. And there's the idea there that becoming a scientist, becoming someone who seeks knowledge, you're putting yourself in a community and you have responsibilities to that community. And I think that this is what FAIR principles are talking about. They're saying, if we want to be good members of this scientific community, then this is a good way to behave. We're contributing to the work of the community by following these principles. But we have to recognise access to that community is actually a privileged position, that there are power imbalances involved, that there's a rich historical context about how that community developed. It's essentially a first world, northern hemisphere community, right? It's not a third world community. And it's difficult for people to join the community who are outside, who are on the wrong, who had the wrong experiences through those. That's my second point. It's in bold. So, that insight that there are power imbalances, there are historical contexts that influence how people access the knowledge community. That's been the starting point for people, particularly people working with Indigenous data. They've taken that as a starting point and saying, well, how can we problematise that? How can we question that? How can we make it a richer, more inclusive community? Bars people from joining it. And the kind of conclusion that people have come to endeavour is to say, okay, we need to enrich the frameworks and consider what are the roles in these processes and what are their purposes. If you think back to the FAIR principles, they're definitely positivistic. They're assuming that data they're not telling us a whole lot about people. They're probably useful to people, but it could be useful just to machines. It's not got human value necessarily foreground. The viewpoint is saying, well, we should be questions about people who are doing Indigenous people. Is it non-Indigenous people? Purposes the same as if you're Indigenous. What ask about how we deal with data and knowledge. And the outcome of some of the investigations is the CARE principles. And we can use them to guide us in thinking about these issues. So, C for collective benefit. Ecosystems should be designed and function in ways that enable Indigenous peoples to derive benefit from the data. This has not historically been the case. If you look at the history of a lot of kinds of research on Indigenous peoples in Australia and in other parts of the world, the parallels with the exploitative economies of colonial powers are disturbing, right? Scholars turn up, they grab what they can and they get out. The FIFO model of research, if you like. So this revised perspective says, no, that's not how it should be. The people who are providing knowledge, the people who are collaborators in this research, their benefit should be our primary concern. I think there are questions you could ask here, and I don't want to go into it. There are questions you can ask here about the time scale on which this happens. Like, do you expect that every piece of research is going to have really immediate benefit for the community that's being researched, or are you prepared to say, well, yeah, we can see that in 10 years this might have benefits? There are questions. But the basic principle is that the first problem is that the community who is researched are going to benefit, not the researchers. They may get a promotion down the road, but that's not the first thing we're worried about. A, for authority to control. Indigenous people's rights and interests in Indigenous data must be recognised and their authority to control such data be empowered. The question of who owns data is complex, and because, well, you could say because Western systems of law have got in the way, right? But this is, authority to control is trying to take this back to a fairly simple idea that Indigenous data sovereignty is real. If the data comes from Indigenous people, they should own it. They should have the authority to decide what's done with it and who does what with it. It's not up to the people who turned up and collected the data. It's up to the people who actually provide the data. It's their knowledge. Responsibility. Those working with Indigenous data have a responsibility to share how these data are used to support Indigenous peoples, self-determination and collective benefit. So this is about accountability. This is saying we have to be ready to answer questions about what we're doing. Are we acting responsibly? Are we acting in the best interests of the Indigenous people with whom we are working? I think you can make a case that, in fact, this goes beyond saying you have to be ready to answer these questions and be transparent about it, but even that you should be proactive. You should be getting out there and saying, we're doing this stuff and we're meeting these standards. You don't even have to ask us. We're proud to tell you what we're doing. And then E for ethics. Indigenous people's rights and well-being should be the primary concern at all stages of the data life cycle and across the data ecosystem. So ethics is about being good people. It's about behaving in morally responsible ways. We're not talking here about filling in an ethics form for your institution. We're talking about treating other people in an ethical way. So other people's rights and other people's well-being should guide us. They're the primary concern. If we're doing things that impact on those, we're doing it wrong, or we have to have a very, very good reason. Okay. So that's care principles. Now, I want to give you a quick example of how this works in action. And I'm going to do this firstly noting that there's an A in each set of principles. And this is where we have the light test to see who's being paid attention. What's the A fair? Yes. And what's the A? Well done. Everybody gets a pass. Okay, so they interact because act is something that somebody has to decide about. Who has the authority to control that? So I want to tell you about how Language Data Commons of Australia deals with this issue. First of all, we give explicit information about the access conditions for the data that we allow people to get to. We won't put data in our portal unless that condition is met. There has to be explicit licensing that you can access easily. And we provide this information in various ways. So the first bit there, the screenshot's a bit small, but we have these icons that show up on entries in our catalogue. The one there is a key with a question mark. That's actually the highest, most protected level that we show in the catalogue. And the tooltip says there are restrictions on access to this data. Log in to get further information. So if someone wants to look at that data, they have to log in, and then they have to find out what the process is, which may be that they have to fill in a form, something like that. There are various possibilities. We also provide links to the specific text of licenses on the relevant pages in our catalogue. I had to cheat a little bit here because the one that's on this screenshot, the Aussie SL data license, doesn't exist yet. So I couldn't show you what you would get if you'd followed the link. But in principle, this would be a link and it would take you to the document which says, these are the access conditions for this collection. Who can look at it, what they can do with it, what processes might be involved in that, all in explicit and understandable text. So that's access. But the decisions about who can access what are not made by us, not by the team at the Language Data Commons. Those decisions are made by the people who control the data, data custodians, data stewards. They have authority to control these processes. They tell us what's going to happen and then implement those decisions. We make it possible, as smoothly possible as we can with the technologies. We make it possible for people to negotiate these access conditions, but we don't decide what they are. We're just implementing them. The authority is with the data custodians, data stewards, the people who have control over the data. Yeah, of course.
So, LDAC, like a lot of applications, is just maybe one of the things that, say, a PDC or a Aboriginal corporation might be dealing with among, a million other things. How do you balance this sort of data custodian and stewardship relationship implementation with not overburdening communities with requests for access?
That's a great question. We're working through those issues. Yeah, it is. The whole area is still in flux. We're very aware that in many cases there are individuals and communities who get all of this, and that's not a good thing. I wouldn't say, we're taking a very cautious approach, and a lot of this Indigenous material that we're working with at the moment is established collections where at least some kind of permissions have previously been negotiated, and although it may need to be revisited, it's not starting from scratch. When we do start something from scratch, I think that's going to be really interesting. I'll throw an idea out here in case anybody's interested. I've said in many meetings we've had on these issues, when we do that, we should have someone on the team who's a PhD student who's going to write an ethnography of the process. PhD thesis I would love to read. But thanks, it's a good question, yeah, a very important question. Okay. I'm going to wind up by giving you a couple of questions to think about. Firstly, as I said, care principles were developed by people working with Indigenous data. The question is, should they apply to non-Indigenous data as well? I suggested that ethics is about being a good person, and if it's ethical to behave in certain ways with respect to Indigenous data, are the ethics different for other data? There are some people who think that's true. They think that you can make a distinction. I'm not so sure. I reckon that probably we could pay attention to care with any data that comes from people. But I think it's a question that you might want to think about. So I just realised I didn't make a point I wanted to, which is I said that FAIR principles are how we guide us in how we relate to the scholarly community. Care principles guide us in how we relate to the communities from which we're gaining knowledge, right? Probably it was obvious, but let me just make it, really explicit. Okay. What I've talked about here has been mainly about academic research, right? And how FAIR and CARE apply in those contexts. So another question is, do they apply, or how do they apply in different contexts? If you're coming from a government department, you're collecting data about an Indigenous community, how much do you want about FAIR? Should you be thinking, are there slightly different nuances that might emerge in those contexts? I think these are interesting questions to think about. And finally, Jenny Fuster, was that a question? Or no. Jenny Fuster this morning, when she was talking, mentioned the idea of careful fairness. This is an idea that's being thrown around in the HASS and Indigenous Research Data Commons. There's a paper on Indigenous data governance principles coming out fairly soon, which I think invokes these words. And I think a question we can consider is, what does that look like? Is what I talked about in terms of how LDACA deals with access, is that an example of careful fairness? Is it a good example of careful fairness? I think that, if we take these things seriously, we need to think about the interactions. Might be these different sets of principles and how those are going to get resolved in particular specific situations. Okay, that's what I've got to say. There's some resources, further information. These slides will end up online somewhere. I tweak slides right up to the last moment, so I'm always reluctant to put anything up in advance, but I'll make sure that they are available fairly soon and you can follow anything up that you want to. We're actually at lunchtime, but are there any quick questions that anybody would like to ask before we end up?
Split the mic if anybody else has a question.
I'm interested, in how these principles can be expanded to researchers that are working on country, because sometimes I don't think researchers realise if they're not working directly with the community, but they're working on country, that this would apply as well. Thank you.
That's a great point, yeah. I think that we need to be bearing these principles in mind, raising awareness in a whole range of contexts. So yes, working on country. Rob can probably, because he works partly with the Planet ARDC, he can probably give examples of soil samples and stuff like that where people are saying, oh, yeah, maybe that's Indigenous data and we need to worry about some of these principles. There are also there are also really difficult questions about going backwards. So to give a really immediate example, at one stage with the project I was responsible for our social media stuff, and there was an example where we considered using photographs from one of the collections we host which have Indigenous people in them. But we don't actually know what permissions were given for those photographs, which are quite old. And what do you do? In the end, we said, no, we can't use them. But in a more general sense, for people who were at the masterclass yesterday, Michael Aird raised this question about photographic material. How can you retrofit our modern sensibilities about these issues onto data that's been around for 100 years? And it's a real really difficult problem.
That in country where, yeah, oh, right. We're really aware of it in the humanities, right? Because we're working directly with people. But, you know, as Rob, you've probably found, like the quote unquote hard sciences or ecological sciences, you know, people often say like, oh, it's atmospheric data. Like, how could that be Indigenous data? Well, that's land, sea and sky. Like it's all country. So I think it's like, for us in the humanities, when we look at those data sets, really critically examining if we should use them at all, you know, without talking directly to that community, I think is really important as well.
Okay, well, thank you very much for your attention. Please feel free to approach me with any questions you have across the course. I'm very happy to talk. Thanks.